What's up, guys? In this lesson, this is part 3 of Intermediate Python. So, this week we're going to be working with APIs and external libraries. So, what are APIs? These are basically things that allow applications to share data and communicate with each other. So, some examples of this are web APIs. They basically communicate with different browsers. So, like, they can give you the live weather, the stock prices, or the news feeds. Programming APIs enable different software components to communicate within the same system. Remote APIs communicate between systems on different machines, so like over a network on the internet or on the internet. How do APIs work? Well, first off, there are the HTTP methods, so we can like get data, post data, put data, and delete data. We can also There are also response formats like APIs return data in JSON or XML. And JSON is the most common API form because it's lightweight and the most easiest to read. And 3, request and response flow. Developers send a request with the parameters and the API processes it and the API returns a response. For example, and this is in the same weather scenario, you can send a city name and you'll get the temperature, humidity, and the forecast. Web APIs, they enable websites and applications to fetch real-time data from online sources. Users can see updated content without manual refreshes, and some common use cases are live weather, news headlines, maps, and stock prices. Allow developers to access vast external data without storing it themselves. The program APIs, they enable different components within the same system to communicate internally. It's used to access internal features like database queries, file manipulations, and OS functions, and unlike web APIs, it's not concerned with internet communication. This helps developers call internal functions directly and improves efficiency. Remote APIs enable communication between systems on different machines, typically over a network. It uses protocols like HTTP or SOAP, and essential for distributed systems, cloud services, and remote server management. Critical for applications requiring remote data access or cloud-hosted services. Here's an open-ended question that you can think about. Compare and contrast web APIs and program APIs. What do they have in common and what sets them apart? This is also covered in the slides. So web APIs are more for accessing stuff across the websites across the internet, and program APIs are to enable different components within the same system, not throughout the internet. So here's how you make an API request. So first off, you're going to import requests. Sorry. And here, for example, this is the URL, apiweather.com. And for example, in this data, the city is Accra. And the response, then this is how we get the response. And if the response status code is successful, this is what the 200 means, then we print the temperature. Otherwise, there's an error, so we stop. This is how you handle JSON requests. So API responses in JSON, we have to convert them to Python dictionaries using .json. So, for example, we get the response from the API, and we do response.json, and then through that data, we can access the temperature, city, and location. Error handling with APIs. Well, here we can try so here, for example, there was also this error response with the equals to 200, but there's also try, and we try getting a response, and if it doesn't work, then we get a request failed. Why might it be necessary to incorporate error handling in a program involving large amounts of data? Because once we start dealing with the large amount of data, that's when errors might start to come up, especially with accessing and run times. So now we're going to be started on matplotlib. So it's a Python library for creating visualizations, basically. So here we can create a line plot. So this basically displays trends over time. We have a bar chart or a scatter plot. So all of these have their own use cases for visualization purposes. This is how you can customize the graphs. You can set an X label, Y label, you can set a title, a legend. You can enable or disable the grid, and then at the end you just do matplotlib.show. So now we're going to be covering some questions. I'll give you guys a couple seconds to do this. 3, 2, 1. I'll be answering this now. So which of the following is not a type of API covered today? Well, we covered web APIs, we covered remote APIs, and we covered programming APIs, leaving only Linux APIs to be the answer. Which Python method converts JSON data into a dictionary format, or like a database format? And that would be B, JSON. So, and that's also shown in the previous example over here, when we had to use .json to get the answer, to get the data dictionary form. In which scenario would we use a remote API? Well, remote APIs are mainly used when we're communicating with systems across the internet. All of these are not really the use cases of remote APIs, so they're not the answers. Which is the correct format for a GET request? So all of these, there are. So here you can notice this is in a string form. Here, for some reason, both these are capitals, so those won't work, meaning that A is the answer. And which library is not useful for data analysis, manipulation, and visualization? Well, we know that NumPy is useful for it. We also know that Matplotlib is useful for visualization, and Pandas is very useful for data analysis and manipulation. This leaves Turtle to be the answer, since the rest of these have to be wrong. That's all for today's video. I hope to see you guys in the next video, and I hope you enjoyed. Bye.